We too, like Luther, believe in that the scriptures are the foundation of our faith, but perhaps slightly different than it would be by other people, by some other traditions. One of the things that became significant for Luther is that in the scriptures there's two words. There's law and gospel. So law becomes the rules. Law becomes and it's out of this that we get the idea of the two kingdoms, and it makes more sense to me when I talk about two kingdoms. God works in the world through two ways. He works through governments, and the governments are all about laws and rules. And when government is good and just and right, the laws are designed to protect people, to keep people safe, and to make sure everybody gets everything they need. It's to keep the bad at least contained, if not from happening, and to allow the good to flourish. But because there are people who do not respect that, there must be some kind of force. There must be some kind of way that good can be. There's got to be someone that's going to tackle the robber and lock him up. And so the scriptures have in their awareness, and they say, this is how you are to behave, and if you don't behave in this kind of way, bad things are going to happen. And we used to talk about God was going to bring the bad things, but I think we're becoming more aware that that when God has a law, that the consequences are going to come to us regardless. Disobedience to your parents. Lisa already talked about it. This is not a democracy.
Exactly. Not a democracy.
The law will come.
Mom's here.
It will be painful.
You're not gonna like it.
But murder, adultery, lying, stealing, all of those second half commandments, they have consequences. And so that becomes the force that tends to, but the law says that this is how you're to behave. The gospel says God's love and grace is here, it's free. And that's what the church is. So the best that a cop can do is sit by the side of the road, have his radar gun on me, and I will not go above the speed limit because I know the penalty is going to be if I go above the speed limit. So the force of law is there. But the gospel is when I'm so filled with the love of God and so caring about my fellow drivers and my own life and everyone else, I will only do what is sensible. And if it's raining out and slick out, I'm not going to go. Did y'all read about the people that ran off the bridge 100 years, 75 years ago from yesterday's paper?
No.
Yeah, they were coming downtown and the lights were dim and it was raining and they mistook the lights for the bridge and drove into the river.
Oh, no. I missed that.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, they always had that 25 years ago, 50 years ago.
Yeah, this
right?
was 50, I
That's
think
it.
this was actually 75 years ago. It was a long time ago. But this law gospel motif is a huge part of who we are. And so we want to say things like, God gives us the 10 Commandments and tells us this is the way to live. We try and live by them, and then when we realize we can't live by them, that's the second use. We realize we appeal to God's mercy. And Luther is really good about, when he looks at the 10 Commandments, he says the commandment against murder is not just about harming your neighbor, it's also about not helping your neighbor. That we're both to do the positive, to help our neighbor, and not to do the negative, hurt or destroy our neighbor. And it's not just enough not to slander, bear false witness against your neighbor and tell a lie, but even if you know something is true, you don't tell it, because you only speak of what's good. And so what Luther wants to say is, we know what's right, we learn we can't do it, we appeal to God's grace and mercy, and then the third use of the law becomes but now it becomes a guide. So that every time I start to talk about my fellow pastors, because we fellow pastors have a saying about that. As soon as we start talking about our fellow pastors, we say, eighth commandment, eighth commandment. Strong Lutheran emphasis. We believe that the scriptures are inspired and authoritative. This is significant. They're spoken by God, they direct and they give our lives direction, but the current use by many churches is they're infallible. And by infallible, what the person means is that they're totally true in every aspect, scientifically, philosophically, morally. And it's the scientific part which gets them in trouble. And this is where things like the Noah's Ark story becomes so huge. Folks will say, well, if there really wasn't a flood, and if there really wasn't an ark, and it isn't, quote, a true historical story, then the Bible's not true and I can't believe any of it. And so they have to force themselves into saying that there was a flood which covered the entire globe, and that only the animals that were saved, and you can't do the story in any kind of historical or scientific accuracy and know it's an impossibly not a true story in that sense. We want to say that the Bible is inspired by God, it has authority over us, and stories like the Ark story have huge significance for us and deep meaning. But it doesn't actually have to be a historical event. And so I think in our society, the folks that have insisted upon that, well, I know in my own family, they've driven Andrew away from the church. I mean, he just simply says, I said, we're not like that, we're Lutherans. But they just heard too much, It must be creation in 724 calendar days. Evolution has no place and is totally wrong. And I think we can speak a word to our society which struggles against that. I'm doing more talking than I like to do.
We're taking notes.
I think it was Paul Tillich that came up with this, but when he says we talk about the Word of God, the Word of God is three different things. The Word of God is, first of all, the Bible, the Holy Scriptures. But second of all, Jesus is the Word of God. And that when we hear and know Jesus, we're going to, in a certain sense, take our understanding of Him and use that as the lens through which we interpret all of the Scriptures. The Bible is the Word of God, Jesus is the Word of God, and any time that we preach and teach, and the caveat is in accordance with the Scriptures, that also is the Word of God. So that to me is one of the frightful things about preaching, is that when I'm standing up there, this is Doug saying what Doug knows, what Doug has heard, what Doug thinks God is saying to the community. But I also know that, when I'm up there in that role especially, or when I'm teaching the class, someone will say to me, you remember when you said? And I go, oh please Lord, let that be a day that I was with you. It's just a part of the reality that it's that is the Word of God. So, first Lutheran emphasis.